Thanks very much, Cheryl. I think you just covered most of the first 3 slides of my lecture. But don't worry, I'm not going to get too technical with regards to biochemistry or things like that. I'm really happy to be here today, and I'm really happy to see such a great turnout. I heard about this seminar series through a former neighbor of mine who told me about it, and I thought, boy, this sounds great. But I hadn't got a chance to, and Judith, I don't know if you're out there. Well, she used to come to these. I had never got a chance to come to them until this year. Some of you may have seen a version of this talk last year at another really good lecture series that happens in the city called Nature in the City, down at the Wolf Performance Theater in the library. So if you went to that last year, it's a rerun. But you get a break, because if you remember, you went last year, it was the coldest day of the year. Today's not so bad. So, as we know, on Sunday, it's an important day. It's February 2nd. It's the Super Bowl. And if you're from a Roman Catholic background and you paid attention during catechism, you know it's Candlemas. I didn't pay attention. And a lot of these facts that I'm going to present to you now about the history of Groundhog Day, I gleefully stole from Dr. Alan McEachern in the Department of History, who studies history and its interactions with the environment. And he stumbled across these facts about Groundhog Day and thought it would make a good story, and it turned out to be a really good story. So in Europe, Candlemas, Northern Europe, it was thought to be about the halfway point of winter. So folklore, folk legends had a lot of sayings about it. And I'm not going to try and read the screen, so I'll go over here. Half your wood and half your hay should be left on Candlemas Day, because you got to stay warm and you got to feed your livestock. The winter is still coming. I know it feels like the days are getting longer, and it always tricks us into thinking, oh, it's almost done. I'll go back to my Scottish heritage, and I'll say, if Candlemas Day be dry and fair, half the winter's to come and mair. So now we sort of get into some of the background about Groundhog Day. If it's dry and clear and sunny on Candlemas, that means the winter's going to keep going on for a long time. And those Northern Europeans used that to sort of predict what was going to happen in the weather. Not very well, I have to say. And they used it with a bunch of animals that they knew to hibernate, and if they came out of their dens or their burrows around Candlemas and it was sunny and they saw their shadows, they would say, it's going to be we still have 6 more weeks of winter. But those Northern Europeans didn't have groundhogs the same way we do. So they used their closest hibernator, the bear. And that tradition carried over to Canada. As you can see in this quote from the Globe and Mail, it says, "What child is not told about the brown bear emerging from his lair on the fateful 2nd of February?" Well, I wasn't told, but I wasn't around in 1897. But it shows that even in North America, people thought that the harbinger of doom with regards to the end of winter was the bear. And in Alton, Ontario, this is going to be, Arden, Ontario, this is going to be difficult to read. The reeve who was in charge of keeping track of the weather noticed that on 2nd of February in 1907, there was mild rain. The bear didn't see its shadow. So Groundhog Day in North America wasn't always Groundhog Day. Should it even be Groundhog Day? Probably not. And Alan likes to talk about this great battle between the bear and the groundhog. Which should it be? The groundhog tradition was picked up from Pennsylvania, where there were more groundhogs and not quite so many bears. There are bears who are native to Pennsylvania, but with more and more human habitation, the bears got pushed out. If you live in London, you know that human habitation doesn't really bother groundhogs all that much. So they still stuck around. So that's sort of the background about Groundhog Day. And groundhogs and bears both hibernate. So I'm going to try to answer a question for you. Why hibernate? And the obvious reason is because winter, unlike most winters, winter is cold. It's not exactly balmy out there today, but it isn't freezing. This is a satellite photograph of southern Ontario and Michigan and Wisconsin, showing the Great Lakes in 2014, around this time of year. That's London, that's Lake Huron, covered in ice. Doesn't happen often. It was really, really cold that year. Now, how do we deal with that winter? Well, we have furnaces and we have sweaters. How do animals cope with it? Well, it really depends on the kind of animal we're talking about. So I'll go a brief overview of how some animals native to this area cope with winter. When it gets this cold, a lot of insects have problems with it, but they've adapted, they've evolved to cope with it. Now, these are two insects native to the area. You probably won't recognize the adult forms because they're only around for a couple of days a year. And this is called a epiblema, is the scientific name, and Eurasta, a gall moth and a gall fly. They both lay their eggs and incubate their young in goldenrod, a native plant to the area. And what the larvae do, they hatch and they burrow into the stem of the goldenrod and they form these galls, these protuberances, these swellings. And you've probably seen them when you're walking around in the woods or natural areas. The epiblema, the gall looks just like a little swelling. You don't really notice it much, but the Eurasta, it's much more round. So these two animals, fairly closely related, living in the same habitat, have very different strategies for dealing with these really cold temperatures. The larvae of the gall moth avoid freezing. Their body temperature will fall to -30, and their body fluids do not freeze. They produce natural antifreezes to keep them from freezing. Eurasta, the fly, allows its body fluids to freeze. So it's resistant to that freezing. Come the spring, it thaws out, it's fine. Burrows its way out, flies away. But they're bugs, right? And bugs are weird. Let's talk about some real animals. How about frogs? This is a frog native to the area. A wood frog is a very small frog. And again, it might be kind of cryptic to you. You may not be very familiar with it. But if you go out in March or even late February, if there's a thaw, you'll hear them singing in ponds, temporary ponds. It's a big picture, but it's a very small frog. It's less than the size of my finger. And it likes to, it doesn't migrate or anything. It likes to, when it stays here for the winter, to burrow underground and avoid the really cold weather. But if it can't, it will allow itself to freeze. 70% of the water in its body will freeze solid. You thaw it out and it hops away. And if you want to know more about these adaptations to animals that can freeze or avoid freezing, Brent Sinclair at Western Biology is really good, and he gives a really entertaining talk as well. Not as good as mine, but. So those animals, I'm going to go back, frogs and insects, we generally think of them as being what you might have heard as cold-blooded, ectothermic. Their body temperatures are the same as the temperature of their environment. They have no ability to regulate their body temperatures. Another classification of animals is endotherms, what people used to call warm-blooded. And birds and mammals are endotherms. There are some fish and some insects, but virtually all birds and mammals are. And their body temperature is pretty high and pretty constant, regardless of what's going on in their environment. So they regulate their body temperature. How do they do that? Well, they produce heat through their metabolism. When it gets cold, you increase your metabolism. And that increases the amount of heat produced. The body can conserve that heat and keep your body temperature nice and warm. how do you increase the body temperature? Well, this poor chap who made a bad wardrobe choice, you can shiver. That increases your metabolism, helps you stay warm. But some mammals, not humans, we don't think, have a unique tissue called brown adipose tissue. And it's usually located between the shoulder blades and around the heart. Newborn humans have it, but we tend to lose it as we get older. And this just burns fat in order to produce heat. And it heats up the blood, and then that blood, that warm blood goes around to the rest of the body and helps keep them warm. But in order to do this increased metabolism, you've got to have enough food to get you through the winter. So it requires a lot of food. Problem is, if you're a small rodent and you spend most of your time eating nuts and leaves and grasses, that's the time when you need the most food. It's when the least of it is available in the environment. So obviously, endotherms do pretty well in cold environments. So let's explore some strategies that endotherms can use to deal with these cold environments. The first one is to cheat and avoid it. Leave. Migrate someplace where it's not quite so cold. And you might notice some of our local birds that live around here, common grackles. You know how a lot of people say that the harbinger of spring is the robins? Robins are really dumb. You know spring is really here when the grackles come back from the West Indies. Some that are, they do pretty well in cities. Some that you may be familiar with to go to the more wild areas. So lots of warblers, they migrate. And if you go down to Long Point, you can see them coming back in the spring or leaving in the fall. Many bats also migrate, but not all of them. A colleague of mine in biology, my next door neighbor in biology, Chris Guglielmo, does a really great research program about the phenomenal things that migrators can do. The other thing that endotherms can do is, well, they can insulate to help retain a lot of the heat that they have so that they lose less of it and therefore don't have to burn as much energy to make some. So if you look at a local animal that lives around here, the red fox, you see them in the summertime, they look skinny. They're not skinny. They've just got their summer coat on. And in the winter, they grow their winter coat and they look chubbier. They're not really chubbier. They just look less lean. And that helps them to stay warm. And those of you with cats will know this too, even though your cat's an indoor cat, because they should be, right? They'll still shed in the spring. So you can help keep warm, but that works really well for animals the size of cats and bigger. It doesn't work all that well if you're a really small animal like a squirrel, a gray squirrel, because they have limited capacity to increase insulation. So what do? They just have to find more food. The squirrels will store more. The birds will eat more. Some birds store them as well. Chickadees, for example, will store food. And as the fall approached, I was going through $50 a week in peanuts for the blue jays. Now we come to the really interesting ones that again, sort of cheat. They avoid this really big energetic challenge by, instead of trying to keep metabolism really high, they reduce their metabolism, let it fall, and allow their body temperature to fall as well, down close to the ambient temperature. And they wait until spring. So, now that I've introduced hibernation, let's talk about some of the hibernators around the world. Who hibernates? Well, it's a question that is getting the answer to this question is getting revised every year. Birds, do they hibernate? Well, we're not really sure, but there are some birds that live around here that we think might hibernate, such as the common nighthawk and the whippoorwill. But the data are still not that great around them. We know they let their body temperature fall, but we're not sure if they're doing it in the same way that classic hibernators will. There are some birds that we know go through something called daily torpor, which is sort of like hibernation light. The hummingbirds that live around here, and if those of you who go to Wild Birds Unlimited, they always have the map that tracks the migration of the hummingbirds, so you can get your feeders ready. They migrate south, and then they come back this way in the spring. Some of them will push the envelope just a little bit too much and are either stay too late in the fall or return too early in the spring and get caught in a cold snap, especially at night, because they can only forage when they can see flowers, can't find flowers at night. So if they're tiny, they've only got, they weigh a couple of grams. So if they find themselves on a cold night with not much energy, they will reduce their temperature, reduce their metabolism and reduce their energy demands until the morning comes around and they can forage again. But they'll only do that for, reduce that body temperature metabolism for a period of 8, 10 hours, not prolonged. How about hibernators? So true hibernators that we actually know about. Some of the classic ones that you see are European hamsters that are native to Central Asia and Central Europe. Hedgehogs, native to North and Western Europe. Probably the best hibernators are a group of animals that were alluded to earlier called the ground squirrels. This is a picture of an Arctic ground squirrel that's native to the northern parts of Canada and Alaska and also parts of Siberia. So all of these areas you can think about as having pretty harsh winters, right? Cold winters, not much food. So it makes sense that animals who live in these things would have evolved a metabolic strategy to cope with these. But there are some animals that hibernate in areas that wouldn't seem quite that intuitive to you. For example, we have an eastern pygmy possum here, a marsupial animal that lives in southeastern Australia and Tasmania. And another one called, I think it's a fat-tailed lemur. I'm just going to check my... It's a lemur. It's a fat-tailed lemur from Madagascar. Now, Madagascar is in the tropics. You don't think of it as getting cold. It does cool down a bit at certain times of the year, but what these places have in common is that they have times of great food abundance when it's rainy and everything's growing, and then times of great food lack during the dry season. So these animals don't have access to their food for a long time, and it seems like this hibernation phenomena is related more to lack of resources than just to cold. Okay, so these are sort of international hibernators. Let's talk about the local ones, like the groundhog. Those of you who spend time on campus, and it's got lots of names. Like I say groundhog to my American colleagues, they go, what? They call it a woodchuck. Some of them call it a whistle pig. Scientific name, Marmotta monax. It is from the same family as marmots that you might see out in the Rocky Mountains. And those of you who spend a lot of time on campus in the summertime will know that they're everywhere on campus. They're so prolific on campus that some of the people in the Lorraine Patterson Western Sciences Center have made a minor internet celebrity out of one of them called Chuck the Land Beaver. Comes and forages around their window and sits on some of the benches out there to catch some sun. So, in terms of Groundhog Day, our most famous, Ontario groundhog, of course, Wyerton Willie. I think we're on our 4th generation of Willie at the moment, and we'll see what he does on Sunday. There are some other local ones or attempts at local ones. Down the 401 in Woodstock, there's Chili Charlie, which is just a guy dressed up in an ugly suit. Elsewhere in Canada, Shubenacadie Sam's been going long and strong for a long time in Nova Scotia. But of course, the most famous one in the US, Punxsutawney Phil. And I think we're on 5th or 6th generation of Phil. But there are other ones in the US too. Buckeye Chuck in Marion, Ohio. But he's an Ohio State fan, so we're not going to talk about him. So these are the groundhogs, very famous hibernators. Other hibernators in this local area that you might be familiar with. Eastern chipmunks. So I spent $50 on peanuts for the Blue Jays. My wife spent $150 because on peanuts for the chipmunks because they'll crawl up onto her lap and help her do her work on her laptop. They're very, very gregarious, and then they disappear in late October. You don't see them. You'll see them again in April. So probably familiar with those. It's been a good couple of years for chipmunks in London. Some other ones in more rural areas that you might not be familiar with are a really cute animal called a meadow jumping mouse. Really good hibernator. Not very common, difficult to see. And again, lots of bats that are hibernators. Fascinating animals. I'm just going to read a list of the local bats we have that hibernate. Big brown bat, little brown bat, silver-haired bat, northern long-eared myotis, eastern small-footed myotis. They all hibernate. And they tend to do it in places that are, kind of have a stable but cold temperature, like caves and things like that. And one of the interesting things about those places is that if you've ever been in a cave, they're usually quite damp as well. So I don't know if many of you may not be able to see this. This is a picture of a hibernating bat, and it's got little droplets of water on it because the damp air has started to condense on its fur. And a lot of people are also probably aware that many of the bats in this area are threatened by a fungal infection called white nose syndrome. So, and one of the thoughts is that it has its biggest impact while the animals are hibernating. It causes them to arouse more frequently, burn through more energy so that they don't have enough to survive the winter or can't do very well to reproduce in the spring. So, some of our local hibernators. Here's another local hibernator. Black bear, local? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. If you live near the Thames, there you get the odd black bear. It's not very common. I remember when this happened. I can't remember. I'm trying to look at the date line on this. 2016. So it wasn't that long ago. But I remember they called a resident called the local NMR. I'm not even sure where the local NMR is. MNR, Ministry of Natural Resources. And they said, bear? The closest person we have who can deal with a bear is in Peterborough. But there are some, bear habitat is stabilized and they might be coming back. Okay, so these are the animals that hibernate. Let's look at some of our local animals that don't hibernate. Who doesn't hibernate? And I'll go through some of the list of animals that don't. So what mammals don't hibernate? As a general rule, an animal bigger than 4 kilograms does not hibernate, except for the bears. Now, animals from the order Carnivora don't hibernate. Now, I know carnivore means to you something that eats meat, but it also is a formal system of classifying some mammals. They're all closely related. And the way they tell this relationship is by genetics. The first way they did it is by looking at their teeth. So animals in carnivora don't hibernate, except for the bears. So animals like the canids, coyotes, they don't hibernate. Foxes. Felids. We get bobcats and lynx around here. They don't hibernate. Procyonids, like the raccoons, they don't hibernate. Mustelids, like wolverines. We don't get a lot of wolverines around here. But we do get mink. We do get stoats and weasels. And until a few years ago, we thought they don't hibernate either. Anybody know what the most common mustelid we get in London is? Skunk. Do skunks hibernate? Maybe. I'm a scientist and I like to show data, but I promise not to overwhelm you with it. Do skunks hibernate? That's what a colleague of mine, Mark Brigham, set out to study. His daughter was actually on the Western Mustangs soccer team. She came to Western, but he did his work in Regina. So this is body temperature of different animals. So they put little temperature loggers surgically implanted into the animals and monitored their body temperature in the late part of the winter. They did it in two groups of animals. One group that spent the winter alone, solitary animals, and others that spent the winter as part of a group. The body temperature of the group animals is the solid line, and their body temperature stayed pretty constant, right around 37 degrees, just like you and me, throughout the whole winter. So they had friends to cuddle up with. That helped them to stay warm. The solitary ones, they let their body temperature fall every day down to below 30 degrees. And that suggests that they may be capable of hibernation. Mark's having trouble recruiting graduate students to do further work on the skunks to help clarify this problem. I can't imagine why. But again, this is sort of a daily thing. It's not really the deep hibernation that we think about. We get other local animals that go through daily torpor, like jumping mice, or sorry, field mice. And it's difficult for me to tell the difference between the two species of jumping mice, but they will let their body temperature fall during their inactive periods and warm themselves up again when they're ready to go out and forage. So some animals hibernate, some animals don't. And a question that really is sort of spurred on my research project is, why do some animals hibernate and others do not? Here we have three members of the same mammal family, very closely related, that are native to London. Red squirrels, gray squirrels, and groundhogs. Very closely related. A great hibernator, the groundhog. These two do not hibernate. So they're very closely related. One hibernates, the other ones don't, or can't. We're not sure. Okay, so to get at this question of why some hibernate and why some don't, we started to answer the question about, well, how do animals hibernate? That might give us some clues about what some animals can do and some animals can't. Now, we would love to study it on groundhogs, but those of you who've had groundhogs in your backyards eating up your echinacea know that they're big, and they're mean, and they're strong. And my first grad student weighed approximately 99 pounds. She punched above her weight, but she wasn't going to deal with an animal that was that big. So we have turned to another research model, ground squirrels. And they're not native to this part of the world. Interestingly, in this painting by John James Audubon, as you can see, they're native to the grasslands of North America, the prairies. Ours come from Manitoba, but you get them in parkland areas just across the Detroit River. So the habitat here is good for them, because it's pretty much the same, but they haven't been able to overcome that geographic barrier of the Niagara River, or their Nexus Pass expired or something. So we go out to Manitoba and trap our ground squirrels and bring them back here. Don't tell the ministry that we did. And what happens when they hibernate? So we did a similar thing where we surgically implanted things that could measure their body temperature and monitored their body temperature throughout the winter. And one thing I want to show to you is that hibernation is not hypothermia. Every year, every winter, we hear a tragic news story about someone who gets trapped outside and dies of hypothermia. Hypothermia is defined as a drop in body temperature where you need an exogenous heat, outside heat, to warm that animal or that person back up. That's not what hibernators do. They're not just getting cold. They're doing it in a regulated fashion. So again, this is body temperature, and this is different parts in the winter, different times in the winter. And what we can see is that in November, body temperature is nice and warm, just like you and me, 37. Then they let it fall down to about 5 degrees. We keep their chamber at about 5 degrees. These guys were in the chamber at 5 degrees too, but they regulated their body temperature. Something happened in November and within the animal that said, I'm going to hibernate now. And they allow their body temperature to fall down close to the ambient environmental temperature. But they don't stay down there for the entire winter. Every 10, 12 days, they spontaneously arouse, increase their metabolism, increase their heat production, and their body temperature goes back up to 37 degrees for about 12 hours, then they go back in again. And as you can see, these bouts of hibernation, they get longer as the year goes on. Just to kind of show you how this works, I have a thermal image here. Oh, I wish it had started at the beginning, but it didn't. This is a ground squirrel that is arousing from hibernation. Okay, starting over again. It's a thermal image that shows body temperature. Here, blue is cold, red and yellow are getting warmer. And this is the time scale here, so we've speeded it up. Animal is starting to arouse from hibernation. It's producing its own heat. It's in an environment that's quite cold. And you can see from about its diaphragm, its liver up, is starting to get warm. The back hind ends take a little longer to warm up. And then it warmed up and ran away to safety. So one of the big questions that the hibernation community has been wrestling is why do they arouse? They expend a lot of energy warming themselves up. Why do they do it? Why don't they just stay at a low energy state throughout the winter? Save lots of energy. Well, they don't eat during the hibernation. One of the things that they don't do is they don't eat. They don't drink, they don't urinate, and they don't defecate. So why are they arousing? Maybe they need, the temperature is too cold for them to express genes or synthesize certain proteins that allow them to survive at these cold temperatures. That's a pretty good theory, difficult to test. One of the other interesting theories is that what do they do when they arouse? They don't eat, they don't sleep, or sorry, they don't drink, they sleep. If you put little EEG electrodes on their head, they spend most of their time when they're warm during the arousals in slow wave sleep. So one of the thoughts is that during the hibernation phase, their brain is too cold to allow for restful sleep. So they're warming up to sleep to repay a sleep debt. Okay, so they don't eat. My ground squirrels, you can give them food from October through to April. They just ignore it. So how do they fuel this hibernation? They still have to spend some energy to get through the winter and to fuel these arousals. So how do they fuel it? More data, sorry about this. This is just their body mass of one squirrel from June through to October when it started to hibernate, into early November. Started off around 200 grams, went up to around 300 grams. That's a pretty impressive weight gain. Some of them will get even bigger than that. They'll double their body mass in a couple of months. Where is that body mass coming from? They're not going to the gym. Most of that body mass is fat. Here is a picture of a very fat ground squirrel. One of my students took advantage of a very smart colleague that we have in Robarts who has an MRI machine that can visualize fat within an animal. So we took one of our ground squirrels that was getting close to hibernating. We didn't. We just put it in the MRI machine and looked at it. And all the white stuff you see is fat. So this is the front of the animal, the tail of the animal. That's fat. So they're storing fat, and that's what they use to get through the hibernation season. So one of the other questions that hibernation community is grappling to deal with is what triggers hibernation or what stops hibernation. What triggers hibernation? And in order to look at that, we have to look at two different flavors of hibernators. One of them we call a facultative hibernator. And they will hibernate only when the environmental conditions are right for them to hibernate. And a really good example of that are these dwarf Siberian hamsters. You can buy them at PetSmart sometimes. And if you leave them in a room with long daylight and relatively warm temperatures, they have this brownish, grayish fur pelage. If you change their environment to have longer nights, shorter days, and cooler temperatures, doesn't have to be really cold, they change their pelage to this bright, bright white, and they'll start to hibernate. So that's pretty intuitive, isn't it? The animal is taking information from its environment and saying, I better get ready to hibernate. But other animals, other animals like my ground squirrels, we call them obligate hibernators. They must hibernate every year, regardless of what the environment is doing. And I'll show you another example. These, again, are body temperature readings from one of my ground squirrels that was born here at Western. So we trapped the mother, and she was pregnant, and she brought the mother back, and she gave birth here. That ground squirrel was born into an environment that was the constant temperature, was always 16 degrees throughout its entire life. The lights came on at 7 in the morning, the lights went off at 7 at night. So as far as this animal knew, it was always either March 21st or September 21st. No, whenever the equinox is. September, yeah. So it had no environmental cue that winter was coming or winter was over. It still went into hibernation in October. Stayed in hibernation until April. And then it stopped hibernating with no cues from the environment. That's kind of interesting. One of the things we want to do in upcoming research is we got ours from Manitoba, which is close to the northern part of their range, but this species lives down as far as the Gulf of Mexico. And do these patterns of hibernation differ among populations that live across this big, broad latitudinal range where winters probably differ quite a bit? So I hope to get money from our government to help study that. So February 2nd is Groundhog Day, and some guy with a nice stovetop hat, stovepipe hat, goes and picks up Phil and says, Phil, do you see your shadow? Is Phil happy about this? Would Phil normally arouse from hibernation on February 2nd? Not according to data collected from wild animals, wild groundhogs, in the area of Punxsutawney. And those animals probably wouldn't voluntarily arouse until late March. And these data are interesting, and we're getting some more data from sort of citizen scientists as well. I took a vacation over Reading Week, which is coming soon, and we went skiing at a place called Kicking Horse in Golden, BC. It's a really nice place. And when they built that resort, there was a bit of a nature preserve around it in which was living a pretty senior grizzly bear. So they put a fence around the grizzly bear, gave him several acres to roam in. He pretty happily forages, but they supplement his food, and everybody seems pretty happy with the arrangement. The skiers don't go in, the bear doesn't come out, but occasionally you get a chance to see him. His name's Boo. And the people at the resort started keeping track of when Boo goes into hibernation. The only thing you can really do is estimate when he goes into his den, because I don't think anybody really wants to go and say, Boo, can I check your body temperature? I'll be right back. And they've been keeping pretty good records of when he goes in and when he comes out. And you could easily find the weather data for this area too, and look for patterns. So we're interested in seeing if some of these patterns are affected by climate change or not, whether they're hardwired. Another one of the questions, oh, and by the way, because I took this picture and used it in talks, I got to write off the entire vacation. Your tax dollars are safe with us. Okay. One of the questions I get a lot is, will humans hibernate? I'm currently teaching a bunch of people who were born in 1997. They've seen a lot of movies, sci-fi movies, where all the humans hibernate, and they think it's fact. And I have to dispel them of these myths. Will humans hibernate? I don't think so. Not in my lifetime anyway, but that's not saying much. One of the problems is the human hearts will stop beating below 16 degrees. It just stops. It's a problem of calcium homeostasis and managing the electrical connectivity of the heart. Can't do it. So even when you might be familiar with, but wait a minute, they cool down some people when they go into surgery. Yeah, they do. And when they do that, they have to hook them up to a thing that circulates their blood. They bypass the heart with a heart-lung machine which pumps blood to an artificial thing that oxygenates the blood and pumps it back around the body because the heart won't keep going. So yeah, you could do it if you hooked up every astronaut to a heart-lung machine. Probably not a great idea. Ground squirrel hearts can continue pumping below 0. So unless we can figure out and how to genetically modify humans to do that, I don't know if we're going to hibernate. So they're not going to we're never going to hibernate like ground squirrels, but maybe we could find another model of a hibernator that might suit our needs better. Black bears, they hibernate pretty well. Their body temperature only falls to about 28 degrees. Human heart can handle that. And the metabolism still drops by 75%. That's a pretty good energy savings at a relatively high temperature. So maybe we should be studying the ground squirrels we think are the best hibernators, but if we're looking to apply what we learned to humans, maybe we should be studying black bears. But I'm having trouble convincing the administration to let me bring back black bears on campus. But it might be interesting to use. So that's about all I have to tell you right now, but I'm happy to answer any questions. Before I do, I'd like to thank most of the research that I do. I just figured that they upgraded their logo and I didn't upgrade it on the slide. Is coming from the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, a federal government program which is a great champion of fundamental discovery science here in Canada. And guess what? Y'all are paying for it, so I'll thank you as well.
Thanks.